family is safe and protected and we're uplifted and can still make time for date night. Be oftentimes after school with him, helping with his antiques and watching.
For years, the Queen's former chaplain remained connected to a world where discretion was treated almost like sacred law. But when he finally spoke about Meghan, it was not gossip that stunned royal observers, it was the warning he claimed the palace had ignored until it was already too late. He was not simply another voice commenting from outside the gates. His connection to royal life had placed him close to the traditions that shaped Elizabeth's reign, the restraint, the discipline, the private burdens, and the unwritten understanding that some tensions were never meant to escape into public view. That was why his decision to speak carried such weight. A man formed by silence was suddenly breaking it, and the question was immediate. What had convinced him that silence was no longer enough? According to the warning attributed to him, the concern was never about Meghan's fame, nationality, career, or public confidence in isolation. It was deeper. Royal life demanded that personal identity eventually bend toward duty, hierarchy, and continuity. Meghan, however, represented something different, a modern instinct to question, explain, challenge, and define herself on her own terms. At first, that difference reportedly divided the palace. Some believed her energy could refresh an institution struggling to connect with a changing world. Others feared the same independence that made her compelling outside royal walls could become difficult inside a system built on obedience and reassurance. The former chaplain's alleged warning was chilling because it predicted no single dramatic scandal. Disputes supposedly feared something slower. Disputes over privacy, loyalty, rank, family, and eventually the power to decide whose version of events would be believed. Elizabeth, in this telling, understood the danger immediately. The monarchy had survived generations of private disagreement because everyone knew which arguments could never become public. आज आकर्षक कंटेंट में बदलें और शेपली करें. Harry now stood between those old rules and the woman he loved, trying to protect both, without yet realizing how impossible that balance might become. Then came one palace incident, small on the surface, but serious enough to transform quiet concern into something that suddenly looked like prophecy. Because according to those who later examined his warning, the real turning point was not Meghan's arrival. It was the moment palace officials realized she was beginning to question a rule no royal newcomer was ever supposed to challenge.
Inside royal life, the most powerful rules are rarely written down. They are absorbed, inherited, and obeyed without explanation. Meghan, however, was said to have encountered one expectation she could not quietly accept, and the former chaplain allegedly believed that challenging it would eventually place Harry against the crown itself. The monarchy's hierarchy reaches far beyond titles. Seniority can shape who enters first, who stands where, which residence is offered, what staff support is available, which engagements carry greater weight, and even who may wear certain historic jewels. To someone raised inside that system, these customs can feel natural. To an outsider, they can feel deliberately opaque. At the center of the chaplain's alleged concern was one rule above all. Once someone joined the royal family, control over the personal story could no longer come first when the institution believed stability was at stake. The crown expected restraint, even when restraint felt unfair. Meghan reportedly wanted explanations when decisions appeared inconsistent. Why one rule applied here but not there. Why one household received freedom while another met resistance. Yet within the palace, repeated questioning could itself be interpreted as a failure to understand how royal authority worked. That created a dangerous emotional divide. What Meghan may have considered transparency and self-respect, traditionalists reportedly saw as resistance to the discipline required of anyone representing the crown. Harry noticed the strain. His instinct was increasingly to protect his wife, especially when he believed she was being asked to absorb pressures that others had never faced in the same way. But protection slowly changed the nature of every disagreement. A decision about protocol no longer felt administrative, it felt personal. This was exactly what the former chaplain allegedly feared. Harry did not need to begin as an opponent of the monarchy. He only needed to reach the point where defending Meghan and defending the institution seemed impossible at the same time. Elizabeth supposedly tried to stop that transformation with patience rather than force. She allowed space, controlled access carefully, and trusted time to teach what confrontation might only harden. But that patience began to weaken when one dispute crossed beyond scheduling, appearances, and etiquette. Suddenly the argument touched royal inheritance itself, and who was entitled to wear the monarchy's history. And that was when an argument that appeared to concern nothing more than jewels allegedly exposed the much larger struggle beneath it. Because inside the royal family, diamonds are rarely just diamonds. Behind locked doors, royal jewels represent more than wealth. They can signal favor, continuity, rank, memory, and belonging. According to the warning now being revisited, one disagreement involving access to the royal collection convinced traditional palace figures that Meghan's conflict with the institution had entered far more dangerous territory. Inside the monarchy, jewels speak quietly but powerfully. A tiara can suggest trust, a brooch can carry history, a necklace can link one generation to another. Nothing is entirely casual, and nothing valuable is simply decoration. That was why an alleged disagreement over one historic piece became so significant. Meghan was said to have hoped to wear a jewel with deep royal associations, only to be told that such pieces were assigned, not chosen. The response reportedly frustrated her, not because she needed another symbol of luxury, but because the decision arrived with almost no explanation. Once again, the system expected acceptance before understanding. The former chaplain supposedly saw the dispute differently from everyone arguing over protocol. To him, Meghan was not merely asking for a jewel. She was asking a far more dangerous question. Where exactly did she stand? Elizabeth, in this telling, saw the collection as something greater than personal preference. Historic pieces belonged to the continuity of the crown. They carried memory, duty, and inheritance, and no individual member could claim them simply because of emotion or expectation. Harry, however, allegedly viewed the restrictions around Meghan through another lens. He began questioning whether the same limits were imposed with equal force on others, and every unanswered question deepened his suspicion. That worried senior courtiers. Each disagreement was beginning to form part of a larger pattern. What the palace saw as protocol, Meghan and Harry increasingly saw as evidence. Then, there was one rarely seen piece from the Queen's private collection. A jewel whispered about precisely because access to it represented more than privilege. It represented trust, and according to those around the situation, that trust would never be extended while doubts over loyalty remained unresolved. The chaplain's warning, therefore, was never truly about diamonds. It was about what might happen once Meghan believed belonging would always come with conditions. Because once belonging itself became the question, every closed door began to feel deliberate. And soon, Meghan and Harry were no longer arguing about one decision, but about whether the palace had ever truly intended to let them inside. The palace expected Harry to help Meghan adapt to royal life. Instead, something far more consequential allegedly happened. Harry began adapting his understanding of royal life around Meghan. The former chaplain's warning suddenly seemed less theoretical, because the prince, once expected to defend the monarchy, was increasingly defending his wife from it. At first, Harry reportedly tried to stand between two worlds. He explained traditions, softened disagreements, and reassured Meghan that certain restrictions were simply part of royal life. But each new conflict made that role harder to sustain. Compromise did not seem to ease her isolation. If anything, it convinced him that the problem was no longer misunderstanding. It was the system itself. Palace officials allegedly expected Harry to help Meghan accept rules that generations before her had followed without public challenge. Harry began asking a different question. What if those rules were causing the damage? That shift reportedly alarmed William. He saw the danger strategically. Frustration could be managed inside a family. But once frustration became a challenge to the structure of the institution, the consequences could reach far beyond one marriage. The brothers were living inside the same monarchy, yet experiencing completely different realities. William's future depended on preserving it. Harry's position gave him more freedom to question what preservation required. According to the chaplain's alleged warning, this was the critical point. Harry could eventually begin seeing loyalty to Meghan and loyalty to the crown as competing obligations, and once that happened, every decision would demand a side. Elizabeth faced an equally painful dilemma. She wanted family unity, but she could not rebuild royal life around the needs of one household. What began as concern over adaptation reportedly turned into colder discussions behind palace doors. The question was no longer simply, how do we help them? It became, what happens if they refuse the arrangement entirely? That opened the door to far more serious conversations. Titles, funding, security, residences, patronages, access, and what Harry and Meghan's future status might actually look like if compromise collapsed. Then came one quiet decision from the Queen, reportedly intended to contain the tension. But Harry and Meghan allegedly read it very differently. What Elizabeth may have seen as protection, they saw as limitation. What followed was not an explosion, but a tightening circle of restrictions, conversations, and conditions, and somewhere inside that process, the chaplain believed the palace made the mistake he had warned them never to make. The warning was surprisingly simple. Never allow a royal disagreement to become a battle over humiliation. Yet according to the former chaplain's account, that is exactly what happened. Decisions meant to protect the crown allegedly convinced Meghan and Harry that they were being contained. And containment quickly became confrontation. The palace's mistake, in this telling, was not one dramatic order. It was the way the conflict slowly stopped being treated like a family crisis and became a management problem. Secretaries stepped in. Communications teams became involved. Advisors carried messages. Household officials interpreted decisions. With every new layer, the emotional distance grew. Meghan reportedly began to feel that choices affecting her life were being made in rooms she could not enter. The palace, meanwhile, believed her repeated requests for explanations challenged a chain of command that had existed long before her arrival. Neither side felt understood. Both sides became more defensive. Harry's suspicion deepened fastest. He allegedly began wondering whether messages from senior royals were reaching him unchanged, or whether courtiers were filtering, softening, delaying, or reshaping what was being said. Once that doubt took hold, even ordinary palace procedure began to look calculated. This was where the chaplain's warning became darker. Resentment, he supposedly believed, becomes far more dangerous when people begin to feel morally justified in breaking silence. If Harry and Meghan came to believe that discretion only protected the institution, why would they continue honoring it? That raised a terrifying question inside royal circles. What belonged to the family, and what belonged to the crown? If relationships collapsed, who had the right to describe private conversations, internal disagreements, and decisions never intended for public judgment? Elizabeth's concern was reportedly continuity, not revenge. She understood that the monarchy had survived partly because its internal machinery remained hidden. Once exposed, every future decision could be interpreted through suspicion. So preparations allegedly began quietly. Contingencies were discussed. What if Harry and Meghan stepped back? What would happen to duties, money, security, residences, patronages, and access? But the preparation itself created the next wound. To Harry and Meghan, it could look less like caution and more like proof that their departure had already been imagined. Perhaps even welcomed. And once Harry began asking whether the palace had prepared for life without them, another possibility became impossible to ignore, that the deepest conflict was no longer about remaining royal, but about who would control the consequences of leaving. Leaving royal duty was supposed to end the pressure. Instead, it allegedly activated every danger contained in the chaplain's warning. Titles, money, security, reputation, inheritance, and family loyalty suddenly became negotiable, and the private tensions once hidden by palace walls began moving toward the most public stage imaginable. The departure changed everything because emotional grievances now had practical consequences. Funding had to be discussed. Security became a battle of responsibility and cost. Patronages, military roles, residences, public appearances, and even the use of royal branding suddenly carried enormous meaning. Every detail seemed administrative on paper, yet behind each one stood the same unresolved question. How much of royal life could Harry and Meghan keep after stepping away from royal duty? For the monarchy, the danger was obvious. Too much independence combined with too much royal privilege could create something the palace had always feared: a separate center of royal influence operating beyond direct institutional control. Harry and Meghan reportedly saw it differently. They believed they were seeking freedom, not competition. But the distinction became harder to maintain as their royal identity followed them into a new life. This was precisely where the former chaplain's alleged warning returned with greater force. Once royal status could exist outside royal service, every interview, commercial agreement, public project, or personal statement risked blurring the line between individual freedom and the authority of the crown. Then came inheritance, not simply money, but memory. Diana's legacy, Elizabeth's personal possessions, family photographs, letters, jewelry, titles for children, private objects carrying emotional weight far greater than their material value. Suddenly, even a small dispute could become explosive because possession itself seemed to answer a larger question: who truly belonged to the royal story? Harry increasingly believed protecting his family required explaining his experience publicly. Traditionalists inside the palace saw the opposite danger. To them, disclosure did not repair trust. It confirmed why discretion had mattered from the beginning. And according to the chaplain's darkest prediction, this was always where the conflict was heading. The final rupture would not come when Harry and Meghan walked away. It would come when private pain became public testimony. When memories once protected by family silence were presented before millions. They had left the institution. Now they were preparing to describe what they believed had happened inside it. The monarchy had survived abdications, divorces, scandals, and betrayals. But the next confrontation carried a different danger entirely, because this time the battlefield would be memory itself. The palace could control ceremonies, statements, titles, and official access. What it could not control was personal testimony. When Meghan and Harry began speaking about their royal experience, the chaplain's old warning suddenly appeared prophetic. Once private suffering became public evidence, silence could protect the crown or condemn it. The balance of power had changed. For generations, the monarchy survived difficult moments through restraint. Harry and Meghan now relied on the opposite instinct: explanation. They believed that if their experience was misunderstood, they had the right to describe it themselves. For Meghan, that decision could be framed as emotional survival. If silence had not protected her while she was inside the institution, why should she continue protecting the institution once she was outside it? But the palace faced a different trap. Private conversations involved relatives, advisors, and officials who could not publicly answer every allegation without turning royal life into an endless argument. So the institution stayed largely restrained. That silence created exactly the cycle the former chaplain had supposedly feared. Each revelation produced little response. Each limited response could then be read as avoidance. And every unanswered claim invited another question. For Harry, the conflict went even deeper because it was tied to Diana. His understanding of his mother's suffering increasingly shaped his fear of repeating the same pattern. Protecting Meghan became inseparable from protecting his family from what he believed had already happened once before. William carried the opposite burden. Whatever he felt privately, his future depended on preserving the institution his brother was now challenging. The same family history that pushed Harry toward confrontation pushed William toward continuity. And this was the part of the chaplain's warning that reportedly stunned observers most. Meghan herself, he allegedly believed, was not the greatest danger. The real threat was a family divided by two completely different definitions of loyalty. One based on speaking out, the other on staying silent. Then Elizabeth died, and the emotional structure holding everything together changed at once. The one figure whose authority could still rise above competing households was gone. Without her, reconciliation became more complicated, more political, and far more uncertain. That question became even more dangerous after the Queen's death, because the crown passed forward. But so did unresolved promises, private grievances, disputed memories, and one final warning that suddenly sounded more urgent than ever. After Elizabeth was gone, the meaning of the chaplain's warning reportedly changed. What once sounded like advice about managing a difficult transition now appeared to describe a crisis of inheritance itself. Who would inherit the Queen's authority? Who would inherit her symbols? And who would inherit her unfinished family conflict? Her death removed more than a monarch. It removed the one figure whose personal authority could still quiet rival households without turning every decision into a public test of power. Charles inherited the crown, but he also inherited tensions that could no longer be placed back in his mother's hands. And inheritance now meant far more than law. Charles inherited sovereignty. William inherited destiny. Harry inherited memories, some loving, some painful, all impossible to separate from his view of the institution. Meghan inherited something more complicated, a permanent place inside a royal story whose meaning remained fiercely contested. That made Elizabeth's private possessions even more sensitive. A necklace, a brooch, a tiara, a pair of earrings, each could suddenly be interpreted as a message. Who received what? Who was trusted with which symbol? Who remained close enough to wear the history of the monarchy, and who was now outside that circle? Whispers surrounding pieces connected to both Elizabeth and Diana only deepened that tension. A jewel could become evidence of continuity to one side, and exclusion to another. According to the chaplain's alleged warning, however, the future of the monarchy did not depend on forcing everyone back together. It depended on boundaries strong enough to survive even if reconciliation never fully came. That possibility reportedly unsettled experts because it suggested something painful. The palace might eventually choose institutional stability over restoring the family relationship as it once existed. Charles now stood between fatherhood and kingship, while William's growing authority made him impossible to ignore. Any future involving Harry would increasingly be shaped not only by a father's emotions, but by the judgment of the brother destined to inherit the crown. And then came the final part of the warning. It concerned Meghan directly, not what she had done before, but what might happen if she ever sought a formal path back without accepting the same rules that had caused the original rupture. And that final warning was the one palace watchers found hardest to dismiss, because it transformed the Sussex story from a painful chapter of royal history into a question about what happens if the door ever opens again. The former chaplain's most unsettling warning was not that Meghan would destroy the monarchy or that Harry would permanently disappear from it. It was something far more complicated. Reconciliation might eventually happen. But if it did, neither the Sussexes nor the palace could ever return to the relationship they once had. That was because too much had been learned on both sides. Meghan had seen the institution from within, its rules, silences, loyalties, and limits. The palace, meanwhile, had seen how far Harry was willing to go when he believed his wife and family needed protection. That knowledge could not be forgotten simply because contact resumed. Any future reconciliation would therefore come with boundaries far stronger than before. A family meeting might reopen communication. A funeral, jubilee, or major royal milestone might bring them into the same orbit again. But proximity would not automatically mean trust. Charles could still feel the pull of fatherhood, yet kingship demanded caution. William represented an even harder reality. One day, the monarchy would pass to Harry's brother, and whatever personal healing occurred would eventually have to survive that transfer of power. Even the royal jewels would become a silent test. Invitations could return. Conversations could soften. But access to inherited symbols of the crown would reveal whether confidence had truly been restored. In royal life, symbolism often says what official statements refuse to admit. For Meghan, the greatest challenge might not be returning to Britain. It could be accepting a structure where belonging does not automatically bring influence. For Harry, reconciliation might mean accepting that some parts of his former royal identity cannot simply be handed back because personal relationships improve. That was the chaplain's alleged final lesson. Monarchies think in generations. Individuals feel pain in the present. The crown can wait for wounds to cool, but families often cannot. So, did the warning prevent anything? Or did it merely describe a collision nobody was willing to stop until it was already underway? Because the most haunting possibility is not that the Queen's former chaplain misunderstood Meghan. It is that he understood the collision coming from the beginning, and the palace heard his warning only after everything he feared had already begun.